This is February 11th, and I'm going to give you a bit of a longer briefing because there's some things I've been thinking about recently. By the way, if you don't know, I'm Diane Sayre. I am an independent candidate for U.S. President. I am a longtime associate of the late American economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. And of course, we now have a wild political situation. We are, strategically speaking, in a lot of danger. The New START Treaty was allowed to expire last week. We have people at the Heritage Foundation proposing that the United States actually triple the number of nuclear warheads. This is insane, to say the least. But we arrived at this point because people did not listen to the words of Lyndon LaRouche, who was called every name in the book: right-wing extremist, left-wing extremist, cult leader, anti-Semite, communist, fascist. Why was this done? Well, to get at that, we're going to take a look and consider what we're learning about Jeffrey Epstein and his connections, but also consider these crimes were going on for 25, 30 years. Ghislaine Maxwell testified that she was basically procuring girls for Jeffrey Epstein as early as the 1990s, a decade before his first conviction in 2005. So I'd ask you to consider, what were you doing 25 years ago when all of this was going on? What were you thinking about? And it just so happens that this year, 2026, will be the 25th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, which changed the United States dramatically. For those of you born in the late 90s, born after September 11th, 2001, you have never known the United States when it was a relaxed, happier place where you didn't have people surveilling everything that you were doing, that you didn't have this entire alternate universe where parents had to be worried about their children. It's been a really different world. That was a huge change. And as most people, I think at this point, believe, like the Kennedy assassination, we never got to the bottom of it. So I happened to be rereading what Lyndon LaRouche had to say on the morning of 9/11, because it turned out that morning at 9:00 a.m., he had a pre-scheduled interview on K-Talk radio with Jack Stockwell. I'm going to pull this up here on the screen. There's Lyndon LaRouche, and this is a preface to the transcript of the interview as it was published in Executive Intelligence Review. You can find information on EIR at eir.news, LaRouche's publication, which still exists and which I write for frequently. So you see, the following interview was conducted on September 11th, 2001, between Jack Stockwell, morning radio host on K-Talk Radio in Salt Lake City, Utah, and 2004 presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche, who was on the air from 7:15 to 9 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. That would be 9:15 a.m. the morning of September 11th, Tuesday, September 11th. Beautiful, clear day. I was out that morning handing out a broadsheet with a statement that LaRouche had written in August, where he warned of a terror attack on Washington, D.C. And so it was quite a memorable day for all of us, and anyone particularly in D.C., where the Pentagon was hit, and New York City, where the towers were hit, and I guess also Shanksville, Pennsylvania. But here we go with the interview. So remember, he's just getting the news. Stockwell: good morning, everybody. It's 5.5 minutes after 7 here on the 11th day of September 2001. My name is Jack Stockwell. I will be here for 2 hours this morning. This morning's schedule in about another 10 minutes is Lyndon LaRouche, an already pre-announced candidate for the 2004 election in the Democratic Party. I've been having LaRouche people on this program by popular demand, as well as my own interest for several years, and occasionally we get Mr. LaRouche himself on here, and we've been able to do that this morning. He's scheduled to be a guest at 7:15, and there are a number of things to talk to him about. I'll talk to him for a while, and then we'd be more than happy to entertain your phone calls. So I am sitting here looking at 2 planes have hit the World Trade Center. Well, I'm looking at it right now on the internet at MSNBC. There's a link on the very first page of MSNBC. You're kidding. A second plane has hit the tower. Well, I'm still sitting here looking at this incredible picture, this incredible image in front of me of this burning World Trade Center as the two jets have just slammed. One jet has slammed into each of the 2 towers. So we'll go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and get my guest on here with me, Mr. LaRouche. LaRouche, yes. Stockwell, good morning, sir. Good morning, Jack. Stockwell, what a pleasure and an honor to have you back on my program again. I had been hoping to move the discussion initially with what we were going to do here in the area of the sublime. But now with what has just happened in New York with this, interesting enough, just yesterday I received, I think it was just yesterday, a bundle of leaflets from your organization in Leesburg that I regularly pass out in my office, warning of terrorist attacks in America. Here, very shortly. LaRouche, yes. Stockwell, and here we have the morning that you're on my program, what's happening in New York at the World Trade Center. I don't know if you've seen these images or pictures yet on the television. LaRouche, I haven't yet. I was just sitting up here working and just heard about it before I went to call you. Stockwell, yes, well, the smoke is billowing out of the one tower here. My wife called me a moment ago, and apparently they caught live on film the second jet smashing into one of the other towers. LaRouche, obviously, this is not exactly an accident. LaRouche, I mean, it's not a coincidence. It's obviously, this is so remote in probability. There has to be intention in this thing. Stockwell, well, it's one thing for somebody to strap on a jacket made of dynamite and walk into a diner in downtown Jerusalem. It's another thing to jump inside of a Lear jet and go smashing into the side of a building like that. LaRouche, the first thing you have to look at, and the context in which this is occurring, is 2 things. First of all, the suspicion that's going to be on this is Osama bin Laden. That name is going to come up prominently, whether as suspicion or just suspicion. Stockwell, certainly. LaRouche, and the second thing, which is not unrelated to Osama bin Laden, is the festival which is planned, really a terrorist festival for Washington, D.C. Stockwell says at the end of the month. For my listeners, this was the planned protest demonstrations. Just earlier, there had been violent riots and protests at the World Trade Center or World Trade Organization conference in Seattle. LaRouche was concerned that you'd have these, anarchist, greeny, whatever, freaks protesting at the conference of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, not because LaRouche supported the IMF and World Bank, but you clearly had operations to destabilize. So let's continue with the interview. LaRouche said, look, we have a global process. The financial system's coming down. That's always a dangerous thing, because when the entire system is being shaken up the way it is now by the financial collapse, political things happen because various people try to intervene and orchestrate events by spectacular interventions, which will change, shall we say, get public attention off one thing and put it on another. So this is obviously, I cannot draw a conclusion except the circumstances tell me something rather evil is behind this thing. And I don't know which, but they're both connected because I know the Goldsmith brothers, for example, Jimmy Goldsmith, was key in helping to create, he's now deceased, Osama bin Laden and people like that, the Taliban and so forth. And at the same time, his brother, Teddy Goldsmith, who is still very much alive, is sort of the spiritual godfather of this movement, which is planning to inundate Washington, D.C. with some pretty nasty stuff at the end of this month. Now, I'm just going here to Sir James Goldsmith. Kissinger, this is an article from EIR in 1984 for people who may not have heard of Jimmy Goldsmith, Sir James Goldsmith. Why would LaRouche be talking about him? First paragraph, British financier Sir James Goldsmith, protege of Edmund de Rothschild and high living takeover specialist, used a variety of British and American puppets to create an elaborate cash laundering network in the United States between 1981 and 1983. An EIR staff investigation shows, and they talk about his takeover of this, I think, Hartwick company, which went bankrupt. He said that Goldsmith was the longtime employer of General Vernon Waters, Henry Kissinger's chief protege in the current State Department. And they go through some stuff on Kissinger, and there's more. Here is Goldsmith. Again, this is an EIR article, I believe it was in 1994 or so. Project Democracy spook targets LaRouche. As an Anglo-American establishment insider, Sir Jimmy became part of the Reagan-Bush secret government apparatus known as Project Democracy. An official of the CIA's retirees lobby, the American Association of Former Intelligence Officers, who served in the CIA London station, described Goldsmith as, quote, a member of SIS, that is British Secret Intelligence Services, Old Boys Board of Directors, and the private financier who handles British intelligence's Israel account. Sir Jimmy sits on the board of media magnate Conrad Black's Hollinger Corporation, along with Henry Kissinger and Lord Peter Carrington. Hollinger recently acquired the Jerusalem Post, which, by the way, just penned a long slander of my friend Jose Vega, who's running for Congress in the Bronx, and Lyndon LaRouche, which has become the mouthpiece for Israel's Shamir War Cabinet. Documents released during Oliver North's trial and from the congressional investigation of Iran Gate detail Sir Jimmy's role in the public diplomacy program coordinated by career CIA official Walter Raymond, who was working out of the National Security Council. Raymond ran a covert propaganda machine whose tasks included the discrediting of opponents of the Reagan-Bush administration's Iran and Contra initiatives. One of Raymond's co-workers was Roy Godson, a neocon intelligence gadfly who has spent a good part of his adult life as a member of the interagency Get LaRouche Task Force. These people used to meet, by the way, at the home of John Train, an investment banker, together with Myra Lansky-Boland of the Anti-Defamation League, reporters from NBC, etc., where they conspired starting in the 80s to eliminate LaRouche as a political influence, which they did by a massive smear campaign, a 400 FBI agent raid on LaRouche's home and offices, and ultimately putting him in prison. I think there's a little more. Yes, hear more on Teddy Goldsmith, Jimmy Goldsmith's brother, the Jeremy Bentham behind the new terrorism. And for people who don't know, Jeremy Bentham was a horrible pedophile. So just have that in mind. All serious and counterintelligence attention today includes heavy emphasis on the threat to civilization represented by those types of chaos organizers deployed for the Genoa Heads of State Summit in July of 2001. This article was written in August of 2001. By the way, after the 9/11 World Trade Center attacks, the World Bank and IMF meeting was postponed. It was not held in Washington, D.C. for fear of a terror incident. According to Teddy Goldsmith, Sir James, Jimmy Goldsmith, and John Train talk together at least once a week, and Train remains in contact with Teddy. Okay, so it's the Get LaRouche task force, the people who wanted to silence LaRouche, but also intersecting Epstein and also creating Osama bin Laden through their Iran-Contra operation. So think about this. Think about what LaRouche said. Something really evil would have been behind this. And he said this off the cuff on September 11th while events were unfolding. Now, here is something else from X. I was just looking up Jimmy Goldsmith, Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein, this is from Dan Meir on X. Epstein was a family friend of the Goldsmiths. Epstein's best friend met him for the first time at Jimmy Goldsmith's mansion where he was playing the piano. And then another person in August of 2025 called Divine One on X writes, Jimmy Goldsmith has a very old connection to Epstein and was essential to launching him. I think they were connected before the Wexner Alliance. Jimmy also had his pet democracy project and his paws all over Iran-Contra. Avid ZIO, just doing ZIO things. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to Lyndon LaRouche, and I am just saying here that I'm not, hold on, it looks like one more slide here. What is this one? Oh, yes, this is from AI, just to know. I asked, did Jimmy Goldsmith meet Jeffrey Epstein? And AI says, yes, I'm telling you it's AI because AI can be wrong, but this seems to fit in with the other reports. Reports indicate that Jimmy Goldsmith knew Epstein in the 1980s and 90s. In 1991, Epstein traveled to Israel with Jimmy Goldsmith, where they both lunched with Benjamin Netanyahu. Additionally, Epstein was reportedly present at a Goldsmith mansion in the early 1970s. Now, to be very clear, I'm not saying that these people orchestrated 9/11. I am saying that on the morning of 9/11, Lyndon LaRouche identified these networks that created Osama bin Laden, that Osama bin Laden was going to be blamed for this, and made the point that such an operation could not be done by some guy sitting in a cave in Afghanistan or wherever, but would have had to be done with backing of powerful government agencies, what these people represent. But I want to give you more of a sense of Lyndon LaRouche, why he posed such a threat, because he was not just a conspiracy theorist. He was running for president. He was not only identifying evil operations, but to give you a sense of his quality of thinking, here farther in the interview is what he had to say. Stockwell says, no, this is pretty serious. Hold on a second here. Mr. LaRouche, I have a traffic update. Thanks a lot. Lyndon, is there any reason to assume that this would be something other than Osama bin Laden? LaRouche, sure, there are many. Osama bin Laden is a controlled entity. Osama bin Laden is not an independent force. Remember how he came into existence. Osama bin Laden was a wealthy Saudi Arabian. Back in the 1970s, during the Carter administration, or shall we say the Brzezinski administration, the idea of running an Afghanistan war on the borders of Soviet territory was cooked up by Brzezinski as a geopolitical operation. Well, Brzezinski was responsible. He didn't necessarily cook it up, but all right, this thing was started, and an Anglo-American unit running together with a certain section of the Pakistani military, the funny boys in the Pakistani military, set up this operation. The United States government and British government and others, that is our funny boys, went out and recruited a lot of Islamic people to fight communism and defend holy Islam and so forth, that sort of line. They recruited in many countries and they deployed them. Now later they killed some of the same people they deployed. You know, they're expendable. So they don't really have an insurance policy that goes with their recruitment, but they were recruited. Osama bin Laden was one of the big funding agents of this, a funding conduit, which was used by people, among others, then Vice President George Bush. By the way, this is H.W. Bush. This is Iran-Contra, or what's called Iran-Contra, which I've called it by other names, which I wouldn't put on the air. So this kind of thing is left behind, and suddenly now we find Osama bin Laden becomes the name. And Osama bin Laden could not last the way he's running around if he didn't have big protection. And it's not just from a section of the Pakistani government or of Afghanistan, it's from other governments who would like to see the effects that Osama bin Laden produces thrown around. So now you can blame Osama bin Laden. At some point you go in and kill him and you say the problem was solved. Isn't that exactly what happened? Remember, this is 9:30 in the morning, September 11th, 2001. LaRouche is saying this. But you never considered who created Osama bin Laden and who protected him and deployed his forces and name for these purposes. As we saw in terrorism in Italy in the 1970s, for example, the people who were running the so-called terrorist operations in Italy were not really the groups that had the credit for it. They were actually runaway NATO asset organizations at a very high level. The same people that killed the former Prime Minister Aldo Moro in that period. So in a case like this, don't assume that the popular names that everybody knows or that the FBI quotes and so forth, that this is the real problem. They may be part of the problem. And then later, LaRouche, because Stockwell, I guess, well, what could this have been stopped, etc. LaRouche says, if I were president of the United States right now, I would have already acted before this happened, not even knowing that this was going to happen. And I would have had the following cooperation. I would have had cooperation from Russia, from Germany, from France, from Italy. I probably would have gotten a good deal from certain forces in Britain as well. And we would have, and Japan and China and Arab countries, including Egypt. And we would have put our heads together real quick, pooling our resources and said, whether we agree on other issues or not, this kind of thing is not going to happen. And we're going to see to it that it doesn't. And that would work. The problem is you got a foolish president of the United States. And I say that advisedly. A friend of mine just said in Massachusetts, he's running for office up there for a congressional seat. He said Bush can't even defend his daughters from being bombed. So remember Bush W with the drunk daughters. That's LaRouche. The morning of he warned of a terror attack hitting the United States in August. The morning of 9/11, he identified a very specific apparatus, which we have not been allowed to investigate to this day. This is one of the reasons why I myself am running now for president of the United States, not with either party. I will not be part of this horror that we see unfolding. And we should take advantage of this moment not to dive down in the weeds and go after every little bit, although we should. I agree with Congressman Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie that every person who is named in these files, especially political leaders, should be hauled in to Congress to testify in hearings. There has to be a full investigation. But what do we do going forward? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Yes, we have to prosecute the people who committed horrific crimes, but what's the purpose of the United States? And here on the 250th anniversary of the founding of our republic, against exactly these kind of filthy games which were played by the British Empire all the time, our nation was founded based on the principle that all men are created equal, meaning all human beings, every child born on this planet. And our nation was good because that was our basis for self-government, the consent of the governed. And we were not perfect. We were on a trajectory to becoming better and better. And then we had the assassination of the Kennedys, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Vietnam War, the LaRouche case, where the only viable presidential candidate we've had in some time, Lyndon LaRouche, was railroaded, called all kinds of names, and sent to prison. And you, the American people, did not get to know him unless you were particularly courageous and intrepid. But you can now study his works and his words, and you can support me and work with me to liberate our nation from this billionaire Epstein class.